Windrose combat feels really good, until it doesn't. On the surface, everything makes sense. You swing a weapon, you block attacks, you level up, you put some points into stats, your standard RPG stuff. But pretty quickly, things stop adding up. You find an epic weapon, and somehow it feels weaker than the common one that you're already using. You dump points into damage stats, but fights don't feel easier. Enemies suddenly start hitting much harder than you expect, or take way less damage, with no clear explanation. If you're struggling with combat in Windrose, you're not alone. I ran into those exact same issues early on. Inputs feel inconsistent, blocking doesn't work the way you expect, upgrading gear and stats doesn't always give the results that you think it should. The main issue is that Windrose does not clearly explain how its combat system actually works. Important mechanics like guard, scaling, and weapon effectiveness are mostly left for the players to figure out. And because of that, it can be very easy to fall on habits from other RPGs. Higher rarities must be better. More damage stats must fix hard fights. And blocking surely can't be a bad idea, right? Windrose politely disagrees with all of that. Confused? Let me explain. Ahoy, my fellow sailors, my name is Wolf, and if you're getting wrecked in Windrose, then you have come to the right place. So how are you supposed to really fight in this game? Well, combat is not primarily about dealing as much damage as possible, as fast as possible. Most fights are dictated by guard, stagger, and positioning. Every enemy has a guard meter. So do you. It's the shields that you see above your toolbar or below the enemy's name tag. Blocking attacks will drain that guard meter. Once it breaks, whoever lost becomes staggered and completely vulnerable. This means that the goal of the most encounters is not to raise health bars, but to break guards first. If you only focus on raw damage and ignore guard, fights tend to feel very chaotic and punishing. Suddenly, you're staggered, and 2 or 3 hits later, you're dead, and you really don't understand why. Stamina management is also extremely important. Every attack consumes stamina, especially the heavy attacks. If you go in guns a-blazing and hack and slash style, you're going to burn out all of your stamina very quickly. Then you enter what's called the winded state, where you're unable to dodge and you can't recover quickly. A simple 1-2 attack followed by a step back is one of the most reliable patterns in Windrose combat. It keeps you from getting too close, maintains offensive pressure, and creates a small pause where you can recover some stamina. Light attacks should be your bread and butter. They're fast, cost very little stamina, and can interrupt enemies or break them out of certain counterattacks. Heavy attacks should be saved for clear openings. They hit harder, but take longer to commit to. So, they work best when the enemy is staggered, recovering, or already pressured. Opening a fight with a heavy attack or ranged attack can always give you an early advantage as well. Positioning also matters more than you think. If you're out of position, blocking too much, or getting hit from bad angles, your guard's going to disappear very quickly. During one-on-one fights, it can be extremely helpful to lock onto your target. But be cautious of doing this when fighting in larger groups or multiple enemies at once. It can be very easy to get tunnel vision and lose some of that situational awareness. As you progress, you may encounter enemies with more powerful attacks. These are indicated by a red flashing light. These attacks are unblockable. Attempting to block these will end very badly, eating through guard shield and dealing large amounts of damage. The only way to avoid them is either running out of range or a dodge to the left and right at the last second to avoid getting hit. In a nutshell, combat boils down to managing a few key things all at the same time: your guard, your stamina, and your positioning. When one of those things slips, fights seem to fall apart very quickly. Early on, you can kind of get away with dodging most attacks, but as the enemies become faster and more aggressive, relying on only dodging turns fights into long, exhausting encounters. Blocking can help, but it drains your guard over time. So the real question becomes, if dodging alone isn't enough, but blocking slowly gets you punished, how are you actually supposed to defend yourself? The answer is timing, and that's where perfect blocking comes in. What is a perfect block? For you Elden Ring players, or if you're just coming from a game like Crimson Desert, you'll call this a parry. So, normal blocks stop damage, but they drain your guard, you break it, and you're staggered and helpless. Perfect blocking works differently. If you block just as the enemy attack connects, you'll see a spark or a flash. That confirms a perfect block. A perfect block won't use any of your guard meter and rapidly drains your enemy's guard. Perfect blocks are especially powerful against enemies with long or multi-hit combos. Each correctly timed block breaks their guard down faster and faster, creating plenty of openings for you to get off big damage. Timing is very key here. Each enemy attacks differently. Some attacks are easy to see coming, while others have more of a delayed window. There are some weapons that come with perks that increase that perfect block window, which can be extremely useful if you're lucky to find one. Once you master perfect blocks, combat becomes much more efficient. Faster fights, stamina is easier to manage, and you spend far less time reacting and far more time dictating the pace. Once you have all of that under control, the next question becomes, how do I actually deal damage? In Windrose, damage is not dictated by a single stat or a single number. Every weapon has 4 things that matter: rarity, weapon level, damage type, and stat scaling. So let's start with the most important one, and that's weapon level. If your weapon is under-leveled compared to the enemies you're fighting, your damage is going to feel bad no matter how rare or well-rolled that weapon is. What do I mean by this? So, the damage that you're doing has nothing to do with your character's level, but only your weapon's level. When fighting an enemy that's a higher level than your weapon, you are already at a bigger disadvantage than you think. At 1 level under, you're already dealing about 12% less damage. At 2 levels, that jumps to almost 25% less than you should be doing if you were on equal footing. After that, the curve does flatten out a little bit, but honestly at this point, the fight is already decided, because that same curve works in reverse. A 1 level advantage gives your opponent roughly 12% extra damage. 2 levels up and they're swinging at almost 25% more power. That's why going from the coastal jungle into the foothills feels like such a big jump. It's not that these new enemy types are that difficult, it's just because your gear is still under-leveled. Rarity comes next. Right now, weapons can range from common, uncommon, rare, and epic, with a legendary and possibly a mythic tier likely coming later in early access. Higher rarities usually mean better base stats, better scaling, or additional bonuses. Then there's damage type. All weapons deal one of 3 physical damage types: slash, pierce, or crude damage. Slash tends to perform better against lighter or unarmed enemies. Pierce is much more effective against armored targets, while crude damage excels at breaking guards and can work well against special enemy types. Now finally, there is stat scaling. This can get a little confusing, so try and bear with me. Every weapon scales with a combat stat, like strength, agility, or precision, and it all has a letter grade that determines how effective that scaling actually is: D, C, B, A, S. A weapon's letter grade determines how much damage you actually gain per stat point. I looked at 4 different weapons, all pierce types, because that's kind of my favorite, but each weapon has a different grade and rarity. And I took him into the first boss fight. So, spoilers ahead if you haven't gotten quite that far. If you want to skip to this timestamp to miss any of this information, you can. Just understand, the higher the grade, the better the scaling. So I kept all levels the same at 6, making the base attack damage 200, and then I tested a single light attack with 0 stat points into Pierce, 10 stat points, 20 stat points, and then 25, because at the time of recording this, that's as many as I had. Here are the weapons. I took in a rare Rapier of 1,000 Cuts at a C grade, a common standard rapier at B grade, a rare sturdy rapier at A, and an epic sturdy rapier at S. And here are the results. The 1,000 Cuts started at a base damage of 153. That's not including the extra bleed damage from its perk. With 1 point, we gained about 1 point of damage, which makes sense. At 10 points into Pierce, we jumped up to 169, which is nearly a 10% damage increase. The Rapier performed similarly. At a base, it hit for 251. At 1 stat point, we increased by 3 damage to 254. At 10 stat points, we jumped to 283, which is almost an 11.5% increase in damage. The rare sturdy rapier is an A tier, and here's where you see a pretty significant jump in the scaling. At base, this hits for 263. With 1 stat point, it increased by 4 damage to 267. At 10 stat points, we jumped to 304, which is a 14% increase. Lastly, the epic sturdy rapier, which is S tier. At base, it hits the same as the A tier, which makes sense because they both do 215 pierce damage. But at 1 stat point, the S tier increased to 268, 5 whole damage points more. Then at 10 stats into pierce, we jumped all the way up to 311. That is a 16% increase. I went ahead and pushed it to 20 stat points, and that trend continued. The C grade weapon was gaining about 1.6 damage per point. The B grade averaged about 3.1 per point. The A grade came out about roughly 4 per point, and the S grade landed about 4.7. Once you hit 20 points in stats, there is a soft cap. The scaling is actually almost cut in half. So I charted all the numbers out here for a visual. Feel free to pause and take a look, but as you can see here, there is a steady upward trend for each tier, but after those 20 points, that curve does begin to flatten out. So all of this explains what your weapon is doing for your damage. So where should all your stat points be going if you don't have the proper gear? Stats like Vitality and Endurance can provide immediate and consistent benefits. More health gives you room to recover from mistakes, and more stamina lets you attack, dodge, and block without constantly entering a winded state. Vitality is also the only stat with no soft cap, so you can put points after 20 and the scaling will continue as normal. Mastery is another strong early investment, since crit chances scale consistently and then they're not tied to the weapon level in the same way that raw damage is. When you combine low scaling weapons being under-leveled and diminishing returns, it kinda explains why dumping large amounts of points into damage early on feels so under-rewarding. This is why early game survivability and efficiency stats tend to give better results. Damage does still matter, but much later on once you've kind of begun to collect better gear and that scaling can properly keep up. But not all combat in Windrose works the same. Fighting at sea is its own system entirely, with ship upgrades, cannon management, sail and speed control, all the different ship variants that you can collect and build. That's a topic I could easily make a full video about on its own. For now though, I want to focus on boarding combat, because that's where land combat rules carry over and where you might start running into trouble. Boarding takes everything that you already understand from fighting on land and applies it to much tighter, more punishing conditions. Here's what you need to focus on. Preparation prior to, as well as being selective on where and when to board. Build a fast travel bell on as many islands as possible, so that when boarding attempts go poorly, you can get right back into the fight very quickly. Only board once the boarding event has officially started. Let your crew go in first. They help control the opening moments of a fight and prevent you from getting overwhelmed right away. Upgrading your boarding party's gear at the Shipwright's workshop also makes a noticeable difference. A stronger crew lasts longer and reduces the pressure on you as the fight drags on. A knockback weapon in your second slot, like a blunderbuss or a club, is also extremely useful in tight corridors. If you're fighting at a level disadvantage, standing on your ship and using a ranged weapon to whittle down enemy health is also a great way to make things a little easier for you once you finally decide to make the jump across. Entering the fight, try and board at the stern or the bow, the front or the back, whenever possible. This keeps the enemies in front of you and reduces the chance of getting surrounded. Fight alongside your crew instead of pushing in alone. Charging in by yourself is one of the easiest ways to get caught off guard. Avoid going below deck during the peak of the fight. This is where enemies tend to stack up and it's the easiest place to get boxed in. If things do start to get out of control, disengaging is completely valid. You can just jump off your ship, heal, reload your weapons, and then re-enter once things stabilize. Only focus on boarding the ships that have the gold chest icon above their name. These reward significantly more silver for a successful boarding action, and it can be anywhere from like 50 to 250 depending on the level of the ship. Ships without the gold chest are rarely worth the risk, so in most cases it's just more efficient to sink them and claim the standard ship spoils instead. There is one more system that not only applies to difficult combat situations, but raiding and exploring in general, and it's easy to miss. Food. Certain food recipes grant temporary stat bonuses, like extra vitality or endurance, and you can have 2 different meals active at the same time, and these bonuses do stack. Rarity on food items does affect the amount of benefit it provides. The higher the rarity, the better the buffs. Food buffs aren't technically mandatory, but if you're not using them to your advantage, then you're kind of handicapping yourself. At the end of the day, Windrose combat starts to make more sense once you stop treating it like a traditional RPG. Fights aren't won by button mashing or rushing in and trying to brute force your way through. They're won by managing stamina, guard, positioning, and preparation. Weapon level matters more than rarity. Letter grades decide how much stats are actually worth. Once those fundamentals are in place, everything else clicks much more easily. Combat stops feeling random, and you start to recognize why certain fights feel so hard and what you can do to fix it. Keep in mind, this game is still in early access. Systems are being tuned, numbers are probably going to change, and some mechanics may evolve over time. I don't think this is the first iteration we'll see, and I have a feeling that some of these systems are going to be even more impactful the further into EA we get. If you're struggling with combat, it's not because you're bad at the game. It's because Windrose asks you to think differently than most RPGs. Hopefully, this breakdown helps you clear out some of that confusion and makes your next fight a lot smoother. Raiders and Sea Dogs, Corsairs and Pirates of all ages, thank you for coming and watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Wolf, out!